I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
$14 billion had been taken out of Lubicon territory, and yet my family still went without running water.
That's climate justice and Indigenous rights activist Melina Laboucan-Massimo talking about the oil and gas industry and its impact on the Lubicon Cree community of her childhood.
These ecosystems are very delicate, and they're not just pristine because it's an engagement, it's a stewardship of homelands.
We discussed the history of the Lubicon Cree First Nation, her social justice work, and what it means to live on the front lines of the climate crisis.
When you start feeling that anger turning into hate, or it's eating into something that doesn't feel good in your body, then I realized, I need to turn back to the light.
All coming right up.
Hey friend, if you didn't know, I started a newsletter a while back that comes out every 2 weeks. I've been delighted to hear from so many of you about positive response to the newsletter. We call it the No Small Endeavor Notebook, where I riff on themes and topics related to our podcast, giving you additional material for thinking and doing in your own quest to make sense of what it might mean to live a good life. Join us by going now to nosmallendeavor.com and sign up there. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com to sign up now for our free No Small Endeavor Notebook newsletter.
This week, one of my colleagues was asking about how I was liking cassava, and I replied, very much. She knew I had an extra stock at hand and asked if there were any way she could try some, and I said, no, I like it too much, so much so that it engendered my selfishness. I'm serious. I look forward to the occasions I get to enjoy my cassava whole body meal shake, and beneath the great taste is great stuff, keeping body and mind nourished all day. I continue to be especially pleased that every serving has 25 grams of plant protein, and that with every 2 scoops of cassava you get 85 plus superfoods, nutrients, and plant-based ingredients. I typically use it as a meal replacement or a mid-afternoon boost before heading to the YMCA for a workout. You can try cassava risk-free with their Love It guarantee. Fuel your day with cassava. Go to cassava.com and use code ENDEAVOR for 15% off your next order. That's cassava, KACHAVA.com, code ENDEAVOR for 15% off. Now, if they could just make a shake for the soul to make me less selfish.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love, starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. One of the challenges of our tagline, exploring what it means to live a good life, is the many presumptions many have about what a good life entails. But for decades, I've been fascinated with individuals and communities whose social circumstances could in no wise be called good, and yet they found a way to make a remarkable life, what I would count as a good, sometimes even heroic life, in the midst of the unjust or oppressive circumstances in which they find themselves. Like the classic tale of the underdog David taking on the Goliath, with trust and courage and a willingness to give his life for what is good and right and true. Our guest today is yet another exemplar of such a life, Melina Laboucan-Massimo. She was born in the Lubicon Cree community of Little Buffalo in what today is called northern Alberta. Melina has worked on social, environmental, and climate justice issues for the past 20 years. She's the founder and executive director of Sacred Earth Solar and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action. Melina holds a master's degree in Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria with a focus on energy transition. She's also host of the documentary series Power to the People and lead author of the Just Transition Guide. So today, a conversation with Melina Laboucan-Massimo. And, as is now our new practice, you can listen for some of my thoughts at the end of today's episode. Melina Laboucan-Massimo. Welcome, Melina.
Thank you for having me.
Grateful to have you with us today, and thanks so much for your time and all your good work in the world. Looking forward to discussing that with you today. I would kind of like to start with the question of how have you learned to cultivate perseverance in light of the many grave social, political, climate issues that you've worked with?
Well, I think I actually had to learn it the hard way, which was finding balance. As a young person in my 20s and 30s, worked very hard and very diligently on these issues in kind of a nonstop, very fast-paced way. That resulting in close to 20 years of impact on the body, and the body had to say, slow down. And so we have to find this balance within our body, minds, and spirits to move through the world in a way that does give the longevity and perseverance, because otherwise, for me, what I saw was, I'm pushing so hard that I'm actually hurting myself. And when I talk about, for me, as an Indigenous person, the sacredness of Mother Earth and the sacredness of that relationship with Mother Earth, that we are in a sacred hoop. If you think of a wheels on a spokes, we're all a part of those spokes. But if we push too hard, one of the spokes can break, right? And so we have to be really diligent as well in how we move through the world. I had to take a step back to be able to do this for the long haul and not a short sprint. So that's, for me, how we can continue to find perseverance is through balance.
You said that you had to learn that the hard way. Was there any particular life moment or event that kind of forced you to accept this need for balance?
Yeah, I think growing up as an athlete, a dancer, a soccer player, baseball, track, I was very strong in my body. And I think I took that for granted. And when the forest fires started happening here up north, for me, I kept working and traveling through fire zones and wildfire without PPE. Many people don't realize how detrimental that is to your lungs and your ability to breathe. And so I actually, from a small cold, ended up having bronchitis, and then it became reoccurring bronchitis. And from a culmination of that, becoming bedridden, because the coughing became so bad that my ribs went out of place, and so I wasn't taking enough time to stop. And becoming bedridden, being in so much pain you can't move or eat or take on or off articles of clothing or brush your own hair. I think that's very sobering because you are no longer as independent. I was a very independent young person, and to having that taken away. But humans are also very amazing, right? So we have like these amazing spirits that propel us to do all of these things, sometimes to our own detriment, but sometimes to our own amazement. I think it's just really trying to understand, why am I doing this? And so that was where I realized, okay, the bedridden, in bed for 4 months, lost 25 pounds because I could barely eat, is very sobering. You take a good look, hard look of, what am I doing here?
Continuing this question about wisdom you've learned, what particular wisdom practices have you especially held on to from traditional Indigenous practices of spirituality?
I had to relearn that balance, because Indigenous knowledge is always about balance, about reciprocity with Mother Earth, never taking too much than you need and giving back. There's this balance with the natural world, with other human beings. That's why we had treaties with other communities pre-colonialism. We had treaties of understanding to maintain that balance within the ecosystems even. And so my understanding was that achieving this type of balance came with like thousands of years of observation on our homelands, right? And so this Indigenous science made us understand there is this reciprocity. These ecosystems are very delicate, and they're not just pristine because it's an engagement. It's a stewardship of homelands that you have with Mother Earth. And so for us, it was about reciprocity. It's about the giving back and not taking more than you need. And so that is a very important Indigenous value that I've learned from a very young age.
One more question about wisdom or observations that you've developed over the decades of the work that you've done In the theological tradition of which I'm a part, we often hear people speak of the so-called principalities and powers, right? So there are these systems and structures of power that at their best were created or intended for good for humankind, communities, the world, and yet they end up overreaching and prioritizing their own self-survival rather than the goods for which they were either created or intended. And that then can lead to all sorts of oppression and difficulties. The question I'm interested to hear you reflect on is, given the work that you've done, what would you say that you've learned about the way systems and structures of power work, either for good or for ill?
Well, I think it's this understanding that a lot of traditions have. It depends what wolf you feed. So do you feed the wolf of jealousy, of rage, that again, wanting and taking more than you need, and kind of this like hoarding, versus the other wolf of love, compassion, sharing, care, concern for others, versus like the selfish kind of ego. And so there's also Indigenous teachings around this as well that go back to, again, times of origin stories. And this isn't just within humanity, this is within systems, right? And so when a system exists to exist, what is the purpose of that structure? Is that purpose of that structure to maintain power, dominance? Do those systems and structures result in injustices, systematic injustices? Or do those systems exist to hold humanity accountable, to ensure sharing, to ensure the reciprocity, right, that we see? And so our governance structures were made to have a regifting. So we have either Indigenous peoples in the West Coast have a potlatch system. We have a giveaway system. So within our ceremonial structures, the person who is the most wealthiest gives back. And that you can see inherently through our governance structures that is connected to our spiritual practices and ways of being. And so there's always this regifting back at the end of every ceremony. The person that has the most is usually the person that feeds the entire community or gifts back materials or all these different things. So that's usually how it works. And so it's meant to be a redistribution of wealth. And so that's the way in which Indigenous understandings of how to have systems that are in place for the purpose and the benefit of good of all people. But I honestly do see the systems within all over the world, especially here in North America. We don't see that happening. We see a lot of hoarding. We see a lot of inequality. And that's really detrimental for all people because it creates a lot of societal issues, as we know.
That's a really remarkable practice that you point to that I was not familiar with. You know, it reminds me in the Hebrew Bible, one of the longstanding Jewish traditions was this teaching about Jubilee, where every 50 years there was this intentional redistribution of especially land as one of the primary forms of capital. And I think, as you were saying, our imagination often seems so paltry. Things like that get dismissed as utopian or idealistic. And yet there you just described a scenario in which it's highly practical and has a profound impact upon the community. So I'd love to turn now to thinking a bit about some of your own autobiography and story and the challenges that you've faced and continue to help work towards various forms of justice. And I would love first for you to just to kind of educate us a bit on maybe the last couple of centuries of history with regard to Lubicon Cree and help people get a sense. I think a lot of times, you know, obviously in academics and obviously in a lot of circles where people are doing lots of justice work, the notion of colonialism is often talked about, highly discussed, and there's presumptions about what colonialism has entailed. And I think a lot of people, they hear the word colonialism and not exactly sure what's meant by that. Or, you know, in the U.S., we'll speak of the 13 colonies and not even consider the sort of social or political implications of what it meant for there to be colonies.
I mean, to be quite honest, it's impacted every way of being. And there's now a revitalization of Indigenous cultures, practices, traditions, because it was illegal. It was literally illegal to practice Indigenous governance, Indigenous spirituality, Indigenous family roles. It was basically everything was completely altered for about 100 years with colonization here in so-called Canada. One example I'll give, and folks in the US might be familiar with, but we here call them residential schools. In the US, I'm pretty sure they're called mission schools. And I'll speak specifically to what happened here because I know the history a lot better, even though we have very similar stories. But what happened here is that the government created a legislation that still exists here in so-called Canada called the Indian Act. And it made the inability for Indigenous peoples to travel, to move about freely. They had to have cards, passes, similar to what you saw in the apartheid system in South Africa. It was illegal to have a lawyer. It was illegal to gather in groups of more than 3. It was illegal to speak your Indigenous language, have ceremony in your own community, in your own home. So these things were all illegal. And so with the mission schools, what had happened was that it basically forcibly removed every single child from the age of 5, usually until the age of 18. There was obviously discrepancies and depending on what school existed where, but this was a government policy that was done hand in hand with the church for 100 years here in this country. And so as you can imagine, when a child is forcibly removed from their home at age 5, it is incredibly traumatic. And not only within those schools, there is now evidence through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was an inquiry where there was testimonials from thousands of residential school survivors. Some children did not survive. So there's unmarked graves for children still, but every single one of my aunts and uncles are residential school survivors. So it's very recent history. It's not like, 100 years ago. It's like literally my dad is a residential day school survivor, right? So I'm the first generation to not go to residential school. All of my aunts and uncles were forcibly removed from my grandparents, who were amazing. We say Kokaman Muslim, so in our language in Cree, grandmother and grandfather. And they were amazing people, very respected, revered within our community, but it was illegal. So you would be imprisoned if you didn't release your children to the Indian agents of the day, and they would come and take every single children from the family. And so as you can imagine how traumatic that is. And then my grandparents realized how horrible. They were being starved. They were being fed rotten food. In some schools, there was medical experiments being on the children. Many of them, if not all of them, were beaten. Many experienced sexual assault from the priests and nuns. And so it was a really horrible experience, as you can imagine, for these children. And the results of that has had such a massive impact on our families and communities. Many schools kept the children from age 5 to age 18, so they had no contact with their parents. So as you can imagine, that's a trauma. But even within the residential schools, they weren't allowed to even speak to their siblings, especially if it was boys and girls. So the boys and girls were separate sides of schools, slept separately. They weren't even allowed to talk, like on the playground. If they were playing, they weren't allowed to engage. And so as you can imagine, how traumatic is that? Like I was just thinking about it the other day of like, that's so traumatic. Like I think of our little boy now who's 21 months. And if he was taken, he wouldn't be able to talk to any family members. And so then you're so traumatized by these places of abuse. And then you have no one to find any emotional support in, right? This is a colonial policy. So this is how colonization impacted families and communities. In one example, right?
So it's just like a systematic, carefully planned, intentional evisceration of culture.
Culture, language. So I'll give you another example. When my dad finally went back, so they hid him for 10 years. So my dad's like a Cree, his first language is Cree, which is amazing, right? Because a lot of Indigenous languages are becoming extinct as a result of residential schools. So he was hidden in the bush, in the trap line every time the Indian agent came, until finally residential day school opened up. So residential day schools, still every child had to go, but they could sleep in their own homes with their own parents, thank goodness, right? But they were still, even within there, my dad was beaten for not speaking English. So his lunch times consisted of whippings because he couldn't speak English. And even though he's like very articulate in Cree in our language and learned thousands of year old stories, like traditional knowledge from before the last ice age, like is a very, very, very wise person now. He has his master's in education and linguistics and the chief of our community. He had to go through just really horrible experiences because of not speaking English, say, for instance.
You said this is still recent history, and obviously it is with your father, aunts, and uncles. But how recently had these practices begun to come to an end?
Well, the last residential school technically closed in 1996 in Canada. They kind of petered out, but they existed for 100 years across the country.
Did I read that Indigenous practices of spirituality were illegal until 1960?
Yes.
Yeah, it's incredible. And then voting. What about voting rights?
As well as voting.
Huh.
So white women were able to vote in 1918. That's when the vote was brought for women, but yet Indigenous peoples were seen as obviously second-class citizens and or subhuman and didn't have the right to vote in their own homelands where they had lived for millennia.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with climate justice and Indigenous rights activist Melina Laboucan-Massimo. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode and a full transcript. We would be most delighted if you tell your friends about No Small Endeavor and invite them to join us on the podcast, because that helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, Melina and I discuss the long history of resource extraction in the Lubicon Cree First Nation and the ongoing impact of oil and gas drilling in her community. It has been so delightful to see more and more listeners like you sign up for NSC Plus. Our growing community is made up of intelligent and thoughtful people looking for a holistic approach to human flourishing. Signing up for NSC Plus is also a way to support the show and the work we're doing, and in fact, we depend upon that kind of support. But in addition to supporting the show, you'll get exclusive access to bonus content, and the No Small Endeavor you've come to love will be completely ad-free. In fact, you won't even hear ads like this one. So go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus to become a member of our community today. Join for as little as $5 a month. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com, click on that red button that says Join NSC Plus to become a member today.
The McDonald's snack wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch snack wrap. Spicy snack wrap. You broke the internet. For a snack. Snack wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
This message is sponsored by Greenlight. With school out, summer is the perfect time to teach our kids real-world money skills they'll use forever. Greenlight is a debit card and the #1 family finance and safety app used by millions of families, helping kids learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely. Parents can send their kids money and track their spending and saving, while kids build money confidence and skills in fun ways. Start your risk-free Greenlight trial today at greenlight.com/Spotify. That's greenlight.com/Spotify.
So when you think back about your own childhood and that reality of an imposition of second-class status or subhuman status, what was that like for you internally as a young girl or young woman?
For me, it was definitely something that I experienced because I live in Alberta, which is more overt racism that I say would exist here than in other parts of the country where I've lived. And so definitely throughout my childhood, being called a drunken Indian, a dirty Indian, even though I'm 10. So it was definitely there. But I think because of being born in my community and then raised in a neighboring town, going to school, and having very close connection to my dad and my whole Cree side where I was born, I loved my family. I had such good memories of being out playing with my cousins and running after dragonflies and going on the horse and wagon and seeing the beauty of our homelands and being treated by my grandparents as if I was just this precious human being, and also by all my aunts and uncles who still love me so much. And just that love of community and love and connection of my family, when people would say something like that to me, I thought it was the most ridiculous thing, right? Even as a young person, I was just obviously there was some shame and, with racism, it kind of instills that shame sometimes, but I didn't internalize it. I just was my family's amazing. I love my people. Like, you don't understand. Like, I knew that even from a young age. And so I think that's where deep down, I was like, I'm going to do something about this.
Another huge piece in the colonialist projects is resource extraction. And so often one of the driving economic intentions behind colonialism is to go in, pull out resources, and yet the people that live there don't profit from the resources that are pulled out, and the colonial powers walk away with the profit. So what's that particular mechanism looked like in your people's experience?
My experience of being on the horse and wagon in just like such beauty and landscape, green, lush, that's my memory of a child, and how I go back and it's dry and not looking well. The ecosystems have been torn apart, dried out. The way it looks now is so different. And that has been because of resource extraction and multinational companies being allowed to come in, mostly through the Alberta government, but also the Canadian government. There's a Natural Resources Transfers Act that happened where it transferred over the subsurface rights from the federal powers to the provincial powers in 1930. But there's actually treaties that predate that. So treaties are actually the basis of how Canada was founded. So where I live, where my family's from, is Treaty 8. And so Treaty 8 was signed in 1899, before the province of Alberta existed. So those are the founding why and how Indigenous peoples came into agreement of allowing people to hopefully share. But a lot of times these treaties that have been signed have been disrespected, disregarded, and not honored. And so, yeah, what happened was that from there you could see the Alberta government giving out land leases, leasing out territories just right under Indigenous people's feet, right? And so that happened in our homelands. And there was actually a study done in 2008 when I first started doing climate and energy work and was doing my master's in environmental studies, focusing on tar sands extraction specifically. And Amnesty International, they did a study for just our territory specifically, Lubicon territory, one of many, many Indigenous communities across Alberta. And their analysis was that $14 billion had been taken out of Lubicon territory, $14 billion at that point, just out of resource extraction of Lubicon territory. And yet my family still went without running water, still went in outhouses, were fighting for the very rights of our homelands because they were putting up blockades, just saying like, wait a second, there's impact already. Women are miscarriaging. There's something happening to their homelands. They put up a blockade. I was 7 and that was in 1988. And so fast forward to 2008, you already see the resource extraction just coming out. And yet like when I first moved to the neighboring town and then eventually to Edmonton, I was just like, as a young Indigenous person, I was just like, what? They have running water, they have swimming pools, they have libraries, they have books. Like the discrepancy between the have and the have not, even though the wealth was accumulated from our homelands, taking out oil, gas, tar sands, fracking, logging, and a lot of water. And so still to this day, the water that is being drained from the aquifers is just like now millions and millions of cubic meters. And so that's why we see the drying out of our homelands and the wild forest fires where the ecosystems don't even have a chance, right, with climate change. The smoke is just traveling down into the States because there's so much forest fires happening up here and also in the US. But here it's just burning because that land is so dried out.
What's your earliest memory of pushing back against that? You mentioned something that happened when you were 7, I think you said. Mm-hmm. What was that about?
It was actually international. It made international headlines, which was like a big deal in the 80s for Indigenous peoples to make headlines because we were very invisible. There was barely any representation of Indigenous issues. Even my experience within our school system curriculum, all of it, there was such an invisibility. I feel like that's very much still the experience of Indigenous peoples, especially in the US. But it made international headlines, and my community was just it was just families. It was families, grandmothers, aunties, uncles, kids being like, hold on a second. What about the Lubicon people? We are very concerned. We did not consent to this. What is happening? It's so funny because I think I've blocked it out because my memories is like playing outside my grandparents' house, running after dragonflies. Like it was playing with my cousins, eating moose meat, just like being with my family. Those are my memories. But I do know that was a part of our family experience, our community experience. And it was like the first part of being like, wait a minute, there's a big discrepancy happening here and this needs to be discussed.
And then there have been, as I understand it, 1 or 2 major oil spills in your area?
Oh, I mean, dozens. Like many of them are never made public. But, every time I go home, people that work in our lands management is like, oh yeah, this pipeline spilled. This other pipeline spilled. I was just there last month fixing one of the solar projects that I helped put up in our community because the inverter's down. And so went to the lands department, and one of the staff that works there from our community, she's like, yep, this was another spill. And so it's just like every time I go home, I hear about them, but they're not making national headlines. One of the few ones that made national headlines was because it was one of the biggest oil spills in Alberta and Canada's history. And at that time, I was working as a climate and energy campaigner. And I asked the leadership of my community at the time to send me the 1-page fact sheet that the government and company decided to send the community, even though they were waiting there. People couldn't breathe. Their eyes were burning. It was very close to the community and it was massive. It was large. And so people were getting sick and feeling like their stomachs were turning. And the teachers of the school were like, we can't teach in this. They brought the kids out into the yard and it was worse outside because at first they thought it was a propane spill inside the school. So yeah, there's been massive ones and then there's been smaller ones that have been swept under the carpet. But that one in 2011 made national headlines because we put out a press release and said, no, you're not going to get away with this time. This is too big and people are so sick and there's no accountability.
What are some of the longer term impacts that you all have observed with regard to oil spills?
When I went back 15 months later after that specific spill, because I was monitoring it, because the company had said, oh, we remediated, everything's fine. And I was like, okay, let me go check. So went back and there's just like a dead zone. Like it just was still a water body, but you could see the film still on the top of the water. And our elders say if there's like little flies, if there's like life, that means that the ecosystem's healthy. But there was just like silence. There was no flies or anything hovering on that top of body of water. And this is like in the middle of the summer. There's a lot of flies and the mosquitoes and the black flies, the horse flies, the dragonflies. There was nothing there. It was just no CMs. There was nothing. So it was just seeing that and being like, okay, this is quote unquote remediated, but yet knowing that there's still a dead zone that's just going to sit here uncared for because a company that should be responsible and accountable is not being responsible and accountable. And yet then it just lands again on the community's shoulders, which our community, as you have probably heard, is that there has been a lot of poverty that has been structurally imposed.
In preparing for our conversation today, I came across this Cree proverb, at least it's popular online, that says, only when the last tree has been cut down, the last fish been caught, and the last stream poisoned, will we realize we cannot eat money. How does that resonate in you?
It feels almost prophetic. It's more than just a nice saying. It's almost becoming prophetic. And if folks want to learn more about the oil spill, we did a short documentary. I think it's 11 minutes. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Oil on Lubicon Land. And that's actually at the beginning of that short film that we made.
Coming up, a short break, followed by Melina's personal experience with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis, the importance of Indigenous history in the U.S. and Canada, and the projects Melina is currently working on for a brighter future. If you care about faith in everyday life, including the news you consume, then I recommend you check out Christianity Today's flagship news podcast, The Bulletin, hosted by No Small Endeavor friends Russell Moore, Mike Cosper, and Clarissa Mall. The Bulletin keeps Christians up to date on the events, questions, and people that are shaping their world. It's a news commentary show that seeks to leave you enlivened, not exhausted, inspired, not downtrodden. Listen to The Bulletin every Tuesday and Thursday and discover how the good news can inform and transform a bad news world. Subscribe to The Bulletin wherever you listen to podcasts today.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Learning through play starts with Lego Duplo. With Lego Duplo, toddlers can develop real-life skills while having fun with colorful bricks made just for them. Large, easy to grip, and safe to explore. When children express themselves with Lego Duplo, they build patience, problem-solving, and empathy. See your child learn perseverance and self-expression with everything they imagine and create. Visit lego.com/preschool to learn more.
Another major issue that is prominent with regard to Indigenous population is the murdered and missing Indigenous women investigations. But can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this one is a bit more, I mean, all of it's kind of heavy, but this one's more personally heavy. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Indigenous relatives, so including not only just women and girls, but also like boys and men and two-spirited people. It's been an issue for decades here in this country. And I know it's also an issue in the US where there's, thousands and thousands of cases of murdered and missing Indigenous relatives. And if they're found murdered, their cases go unsolved. And this is also the case for my sister, Bella, who was a college graduate in Toronto and just finished as a college graduate 3 months later. Wrong place, wrong time. Case unsolved still to this day. So it is not just something that people say, it's something that people experience as a lived experience every day.
As I understand it, these are not just a few cases here and there, but thousands of cases.
Thousands, yeah. Thousands. Spanning over decades. And some of them, it's vulnerability because serial killers, both in the US and Canada, see Indigenous women as vulnerable, more vulnerable populations, less punitive measures, and are identified as easier to victimize.
Thank you for sharing that.
One thing that I do feel like would be helpful if you want to learn more about murdered and missing people, there was actually a national inquiry that many of our families pushed for in this country, and you can find it online. So if you want to learn more about Indigenous history, which is not Indigenous history, I mean, it's Canadian history and US history. It's not just something relegated to Indigenous peoples, but it's a collective shared history of how both US and Canada exist. But something that's really helpful for people if you really want to deepen your understanding of these histories and really read documented accounts and or government documents. So you can find them both online. One is called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this is like volumes of documentation of residential school survivors and then recommendations towards various levels of, including media, government, institutions, schools, police forces, recommendations. So TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that was released in 2015. And then there's a national inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women and children, and that was released a number of years back. And so my family actually participated in the national inquiry where commissioners went across the country to interview families that have murdered and missing Indigenous women and children. So that is actually another really good resource that is online as well. So feel free to look that up because I think those are two really helpful resources that have been created and a lot of hard work that was done by commissioners and lawyers and government bureaucrats and then family advocates that have pushed really hard to have those both done, especially both for residential school survivors and then also for murdered and missing Indigenous family members.
With all of these historical realities that are indeed so heavy, What has been your relationship with anger and or how anger has factored in your own work in the world?
I feel like there's like a righteous anger, you know? Again, it goes back to that, like, what wolf are you going to feed? And when you realize, when you start feeling that anger seeding into hate or it's seeding into something that doesn't feel good in your body, in my heart, then I realized, oh, I need to do some healing work. I need to pivot and turn back to the light, so to speak. And then there's a righteous anger that is full of light, but it's also a righteous anger to do something to make the situation better. That's my relationship with it, that balance of really the self-examination of what is my relationship to this? What am I feeling in my heart, mind, body, spirit? Like really feeling deeply into what it is, exploring, examining, and then doing the appropriate thing I need to do to ensure that I'm engaging within a way that's healthy for me and healthy for those around me and the world.
So back to your comments about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, from what I understand, from what bit I've read about this, the results have been mixed with regard to some injustices. There's been some progress dealing with some things in a constructive way and others perhaps not yet. But it strikes me that that's a profoundly different way than, for example, in the United States, we've never had any kind of analog to a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Instead, what we currently are seeing, the impetus in the United States is to increasingly squelch any kind of conversation about the difficult realities of our own history. What do you see from your perspective on what's happening south of your border, of the so-called Canadian border, with what's happening here?
Yeah, I see it and I'm witnessing it with sadness, with a little bit of despair, and also indignation. It always comes back to education. It always comes back to educating our populations and our peoples across the board of what actually happened in the history of a people. And when you don't know the history of your own country, then it leaves you vulnerable to the perpetuation of that history because you don't have that reflection of what can we do better? What can we do differently? What do we not want to repeat? But when an education and a history is left systematically out of the curriculum, then that is such a detriment to the people, all people that live in that country, including here as well. And I see a change, fortunately here, that is different than south of the medicine line. We say medicine line for the border because there's a history of when Indigenous peoples were being killed and slaughtered and our scalps were worth 5 cents. And there's literally posters of it. And so when there was that line designation of the border, Indigenous peoples ran north, trying to get away from being murdered and killed. And many people that didn't make that were shackled. And, you know, there's the Trail of Tears that I'd say if people haven't in the US know of the Trail of Tears, definitely look it up because that's, again, a collective history that's been not talked about in curriculum in education systems, from my understanding, where people were shackled and forcibly removed from their own homelands that were Indigenous. And so I'd say it's, again, a criminalization and a silencing and erasure of voices and history and people. And it's a detriment because it just creates siloing, hate, and unnecessary division of humans. And it's a sad state of affairs, I would say. And I say what we see differently happening here. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it because it's not perfect up here. don't get me wrong. Like you said, for those recommendations of both the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the National Inquiry on Murder and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, is that there's still a lot of work to be done in making sure those recommendations are taken to fruition and acted upon, right? There's the summary pages. And if you don't have time to read volumes of histories, there's those recommendations that are in both of those national inquiries. And it's just unfortunate that that hasn't happened in the US because I'm sure there would be, again, volumes.
Share with us some about some of the work that you've done in seeking to address some of these perennial troubles, especially Sacred Earth Solar, or any other that you would like to point us to about some of the work that you feel most excited about?
Yeah, I think because I've seen, and experienced myself the lack of history shared in educational systems in our curriculum that's been left out. I have, for about 20 years, done many, many, many talks, hundreds into the thousands of talks in classrooms, in town halls, in US Congress, Norwegian Parliament, just with investors, with media, so I think that was related to like a little bit of the burnout of just saying yes and talking to as many audiences as I could to really ensure that there was an Indigenous perspective and recount of history and discussion of what was happening and those ongoing grievances that we still see happening. So that was a lot of the work that I have done over the past number of years. And then more recently was working previously for non-Indigenous climate and environment organizations. And then with other Indigenous colleagues, decided to found an organization called Indigenous Climate Action, and then also founded Sacred Earth specifically, which is my main focus right now these days. And we have a number of staff that's a national organization here. And we focus on climate education and literacy. So developing trainings for a national audience. So we have, again, continuing to do that education piece, but also in local communities where we're teaching about the research that I developed from my master's thesis. It's in there. My master's thesis is in the Just Transition Guide, which you can find on our website, and Sacred Earth Solar. And it talks about energy education and also with that Indigenous lens to talk about what our experiences are and then what our community's doing to address the climate crisis from their own leadership and from within their own community. So I also was able to shoot a TV show called Power to the People. And it is a TV show where I went from coast to coast to coast to interview and profile Indigenous communities that were implementing climate solutions across their homelands. That's a TV show that airs on 3 networks here in Canada, 1 in the US, and then 1 in Australia. And so also uplifting those community stories, not just my own, where we've done some work, but also Sacred Earth has helped communities from different provinces across the country in their homelands to implement climate solutions, namely solar, but also we're currently working on like a seed storage where communities can store their own seeds and ensure that they can continue to plant and have some food sovereignty and security in their own communities. And so we also work on federal and provincial policy, climate policy, ensuring that there's accessibility and affordability for communities, energy transition, and then also we do implementation projects themselves. And so that's, keeps us quite busy.
Yeah, I bet it does. What are some of the implementation projects that you're most excited about right now that you're finding yourself impressed with?
I love that we can work with community partners, and then we work with community partners to bring more capacity to those communities. We do the training within the communities, and then we help the community implement the project. We just solarized this past year a healing lodge with an organization called No More Silence. We also solarized a ceremonial longhouse with the Cayuga Nation and the Sour Springs Longhouse to solarize their longhouse. We've solarized with community partners in 3 areas in the West Coast, and then also solarizing with a youth group that is in Saskatchewan. They're solarizing for their community inside Saskatchewan, which is like a new project for us. And then the original project that I did as my master's thesis was to solarize my community's health center. And that was a decade ago. And so that was the first project that I got my hands in terms of tangible solar climate implementation. And now I'm supporting my nation, my community to build a larger 1.5 megawatt system. So a much larger, kind of more like a solar farm. And so we're in those processes of fundraising and then doing the capacity building and training, starting with this next month as a climate and energy summer school.
Again, we'll put links to all of those projects and resources on our website for the show notes for this particular episode. Melina, thank you so much for the conversation today. We've been talking to Melina Laboucan-Massimo. Thank you for your
work and your lovely spirit and your time to share with us today.
Thank you for having me. It was great talking with you.
Here's just one small closing take on our remarkable conversation with Melina. Numerous practices, helpful commitments in life, 3 in particular stood out to me. First, a commitment simply to finding balance. Life is not a sprint, it's a marathon, or so maintained the college president who hired me to be a faculty member many years ago. That is, our lives will be much more productive over the long haul if we will prepare ourselves for the long, continuous work that must be done, rather than moving overly quickly from one thing to the next. This requires us to find that place at which each of us individually must say, enough, or that's all I can do. Or at least it seems to me we must find that place if we're going to continue to do work of truth-telling, or justice work, or education, or generosity, and to do it for the long haul. Along with that sort of individual commitment to enough are social practices of enough. A social commitment where each of us will ask ourselves, do we have enough? Will we allow ourselves not to take more than is needed, not to take more than our own share? And if we find ourselves with more than our share, will we be willing to practice re-gifting? Will we allow ourselves to give back to a community that has made it possible for us to have an abundance more than is needed? Secondly, if you care about justice, pay attention. Pay attention to the power, the money, and the culture, and especially sanctions upon culture. Pay attention to who is being silenced and ask why. Ask what stories need to be told, what historic wrongs need to be honored or rectified. I'm taken by these alternative possibilities in Canada and South Africa, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, in which those who have suffered severe oppression are able to tell their stories, to recount their experience, and to tell it in public. In contrast, we're increasingly seeing pressures of censoring, of silencing the stories of historic wrongs committed in and by the United States. Third, of being driven by love. A remarkable account in which Melina said she looked at the sorts of criticisms, critique, or shame of her people and said, no, I love my family, I love my people, I love my culture, and I'm going to do something about this. This beautiful space of saying, what might love drive me to be and drive me to do? In the same way, when I asked her about anger, she said, pay attention to it, note what it's doing in your body, and let the anger then fuel you to actually do something constructive. That's just one small take on today's episode. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Melina Laboucan-Massimo. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carriot Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.